Hi, I'd like to talk about boundaries and healthy relationships. Without good, strong boundaries, we can easily lose sight of who we are. Many of us can think back to situations where saying no had felt so uncomfortable that we had to say yes instead. Boundaries define us and are crucial in forming healthy relationships. For 6 years, I worked at an addiction recovery center famous for its work in codependency. Central to the theme of codependency was the concept of boundaries. I worked with great leaders in the field and learned a lot about boundaries, but it wasn't until I had the opportunity to attend a workshop that included Christian authors John Townsend and Henry Cloud that I learned the spiritual healing involved in boundaries. Today I will explain the function of boundaries and give insight into the physical, verbal, and emotional boundaries. I will also touch on the concept of spirituality in boundaries. Let me start by saying that the boundaries are not walls. On the contrary, they are more like fences. And when the situation is right, we can let something good in. What boundaries do is define who we are and who we are not. Boundaries define our souls and help us to guard it. Everyone has the right to define him or herself, so they have the right to set their own boundaries. Being cautious about how much of ourselves we share with others is a boundary, whether we are talking about verbal, emotional, or physical sharing. We also need to be careful about how much of others we take in as they share about themselves. Sometimes their burdens are too much for us to bear. One of the most critical boundaries is our skin. It not only keeps things like germs out, it also keeps our body parts in. That is the twofold system of boundaries. The purpose of boundaries is protection from outside sources and for containment of self. The boundary of skin is the very first boundary we experience. People who have been sexually or physically abused have had their skin boundary violated. This is a horrendous violation because it affects the very nature and the very definition of who they are, and they have a hard time remembering where they end and where others begin. With physical boundaries, we can usually see where a line can be drawn between what is ours and what is not ours. A property line is a good example of a physical boundary. Another example is merchandise in a store or the personal possessions on a coworker's desk. Some people say that each of us have an 18-inch area around us that is personal and private, and that we should respect this area when interacting with others. In the facility where I worked, we had given some of the patients hula hoops to carry around to remind them about this area as they interacted with others in the facility, so they carried hula hoops around with them. Besides this personal area, other geographical distances can keep us out of harm's way. Sometimes even physically removing ourselves from a situation or a place can keep us safe. Besides the boundaries that we can see or measure, there are unseen boundaries working throughout our relationships with others. The boundaries we set through our discernments are equally as important as physical boundaries. A basic verbal boundary is the word no. The Bible tells us to use the word no. Matthew 5, verse 37 tells us that we are to let our yes be yes and our no be no. Being able to say no allows us to protect ourselves from the behaviors and the people that we do not want in our lives. Discernment requires us to have a good, strong no. So does leadership. Our no defines where we stand and who we are. Truth is another boundary. Understanding truth through God's word keeps us safe from evil. When Jesus was tempted by Satan, he spoke truth through the scriptures, and Satan fled. Knowing that what the truth is will give your no strength, and it will give it direction. Time is a boundary. For example, we can spend time in prayer, and that defines our priorities and who we are. Time is also critical when we need to take a breather from a needy person who is infringing too much on our time. Speaking of needy people, sometimes we need to use emotional distance as a boundary in order to regain a sense of where we end and the other person begins. Needy people can be everywhere in our lives, so this is a very important boundary. We never want to lose sight of who we are. When others are demanding too much from us, whether they are our spouses, our friends, neighbors, pastors, children, parents, co-worker, or boss, we need emotional distance in order to have the strength to say no more often. Setting these types of limits begins by thinking through what our motives truly are. If we are confused about what we own or what our responsibility is, we have a boundary problem. Since we are responsible for our behaviors and choices, we must also accept the consequences as a result. Thinking through our decisions before acting on them causes proactive boundaries as opposed to reactive boundaries. The major difference between the two is love. The first example of a boundary violation was in the Garden of Eden, when Eve thought that she could possess God's wisdom by eating a forbidden apple. God had set a boundary for his creation, and Eve violated it. She wanted to be God. Ever since Eve, people tend to violate the same boundary by playing God in one way or another. There is a prayer that speaks to this problem called the Serenity Prayer, and the beginning goes something like this. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. In this prayer, the wisdom to know the difference is to know where we end and God begins. As a Christian, one of my very first boundaries I needed to learn was the boundary between God and me. In other words, it was difficult for me to be in God's will if I was imposing my will upon God. So by learning, practicing, and teaching boundaries, my relationship with God and others has grown deeper and richer. Now you can see the full effect of boundaries when defining who we are and their importance in forming healthy relationship with others and with God. I spoke about boundaries as physical, verbal, emotional, and spiritual. Being a Christian does not mean we can never say no. Being a Christian means saying no when we are speaking out of love. Thank you.